Well, good morning everybody, and you're all very welcome to Dublin Castle for the Agriculture and Climate Change Science into Action Conference. This event is being hosted by the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. My name is Helen, Carroll, and I'll be your moderator for the event. Ireland currently holds the chair of the Global Research Alliance for Agricultural Greenhouse Gases, and today's event is all about sharing innovative solutions and research findings aimed at addressing climate action with our partners from Europe and around the world. This week, the Department has been sharing the annual Council meeting of the Global Research Alliance, and I'd particularly like to welcome all of the GRA delegates who are joining us today. They bring with them details on some very exciting flagship research projects, and I don't know if many of you have had the opportunity yet to look at some of the poster presentations in the foyer. If you haven't done so, you will get the opportunity as the day progresses, and please do. There are some very exciting things happening in research. We have a busy agenda to get through today. I'll do my best to make sure everything runs to time and you get to enjoy your coffee and lunch breaks, because for some of you they're probably the most important part of the day. A chance to catch up with your peers, do a bit of networking and have a cup of coffee. So we know we can't rush that. There has been a slight change to the programme due to the Minister's diaries. We're going to go straight into session 1 now, and after that we'll be joined by Minister Heydon and An Taoiseach Micheál Martin. Just to let you know, this event is being recorded but not live streamed. Recordings will be available on the Department's website after the event. I'd remind you all to keep your phones on silent, but do keep them on because we're using Slido throughout the day for questions and answers. The details on how to connect are up on the screen now. You can scan that QR code. You can also join the event by opening a web page on Chrome or Safari and enter the code to access the Q&A feed. There's also QR codes for Slido out in the foyer, so if you're out there and you don't get the chance to do it now, you can do it later. There's also a QR code on your lanyard. That QR code is for the day's programme. It's not for Slido, but scan that and that will bring you up today's programme. Questions will be moderated today, mainly just to avoid duplication. So before you do submit a question on Slido, have a scroll down and see if it's already been asked before you put in your own. And once the questions are published, you can scroll down and you can upvote the question you're most interested in by pressing the thumbs up button. That will prompt me to ask the most popular questions. So that's it for now. I hope you all enjoy the conference. As I said, we're going straight into session 1 now, which is from global climate science to national adaptation, implications for our agri-food sector. I'd ask our 2 speakers for session 1 to make their way up to the stage while we play this short film.
Agriculture remains a vital part of Ireland's economy and culture. In 2024, the sector generated over €19 billion in exports and supported 169,000 jobs across more than 133,000 farms. Agriculture and land use have a major role to play in reducing their impact on climate change and reaching the national target of climate neutrality by 2050. While this is challenging, progress is being made. Agricultural emissions in 2023 were down 4.9% from 2022. We are already implementing many of the tools necessary to reduce emissions, such as reducing chemical fertilizer rates, changing fertilizer type, and improving animal breeding. But research and innovation, supported by the Department of Agriculture, will provide additional new ways to mitigate and offset agricultural emissions. Since 2020, the Department has provided over €48 million in climate-related agricultural research and innovation. This funding supports the development of new technologies, expertise and infrastructure. International collaboration is essential in accelerating progress, and the Department has committed almost €25 million to joint research with partners in Northern Ireland, the EU and New Zealand to address shared climate challenges. This investment in research is already delivering practical outcomes. For example, studies have shown that breeding for low methane emitting cattle and sheep can cut emissions by up to 20%. Feed additives have demonstrated methane reductions of up to 30%. Through initiatives like the Global Research Alliance, Ireland is working with international partners to incorporate low methane traits into national breeding indices and to adapt indoor feed additive technologies for use in pasture-based systems. Development of low-nitrogen pasture systems with clover and multi-species swards can reduce fertiliser use by 50%, while nitrogen inhibitors can cut emissions by up to 70%, while maintaining or even improving farm productivity and profitability. Irish soils store between 63 and 123 tonnes of carbon per hectare and are a major carbon sink. Research is underway to protect and enhance these vital carbon stocks. More accurate monitoring and measurement of animal and land-based emissions is helping to ensure greater precision in the inventory of the sector's greenhouse gas emissions. All of this is being brought to life on farms across the country. Teagasc signpost farms are demonstrating these climate-smart solutions, supported by innovations like AgNav. Together, Irish farmers, researchers, advisors, policymakers and industry are building a more sustainable agri-food sector, guided by science, innovation and a shared commitment to climate action.
One final reminder before we go into the presentations, and this is not just aimed at the two gentlemen sitting on the stage. I'd like to remind all of today's speakers to please stick to their allotted time. It really is a very full agenda, and if anybody overruns, all you're doing is running into somebody else's time. So you've been warned. I'll introduce our first speaker. It's Peter Thorne, Professor of Physical Geography, Climate Science at Maynooth University and an IPCC lead author. Peter.
Thank you very much. And there you go, we can go straight in. Okay, so I'm going to give some outcomes from the IPCC synthesis report, which is the latest assessment. Assessments happen every 6 to 7 years. We'll dive straight in. The first point is that climate change since the late 19th century is entirely due to us. It's not a little bit of it, it's all of it. I want to draw your attention to the graph on the right here. This is annual emissions of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, from fossil fuels, from land use change, and non-CO2, which is methane, nitrous oxide, and a whole host of synthetic gases. These are annual emissions, sadly not cumulative emissions, so we are still heading fundamentally the wrong way. Those emissions have led to increases in concentrations of the greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is about 50% above pre-industrial. Methane is almost double pre-industrial levels. Nitrous oxide has increased. These changes are greater than anything we have seen in the last 2 million years. They are greater than consecutive glacial interglacial cycles. And these have led to changes in observed temperatures. Global warming has happened at the time of the IPCC report by about 1.2 degrees centigrade. The two bars on the right I want to bring your attention to are the two orange bars. The left hand of those is the observed warming, and the right hand is when we do complex statistical analysis to determine how much of that is due to humans. And you'll note those two bars are exactly the same height. All of the warming we have seen is due to us. We have seen additional warming since the IPCC, and 2024 was the first year likely warmer than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And Europe, where we all are, is the fastest warming continent in the world. So key point number 2, we are already feeling the effects of climate change, and those least responsible are most vulnerable. And I note that the video that preceded me was all about mitigation. If we don't forget about the fact that farmers are at the forefront of the impacts of climate change and need to adapt, then we're doing a disservice to the community and the sector. We have seen, this looks like a world map. These hexagons are world regions. You want to draw your attention to Northern Europe, NEU in here. The 3 dots means high confidence, which means we've got lots of evidence and it's all in agreement, and this is for heat waves. So human influence on heat waves in our region of the world is undoubtedly true. The next slide shows the same, but for extreme precipitation, and you'll note here there's many fewer places where there's evidence. The one place where there's very high confidence is Northern Europe. So those heat waves we see, those extreme precipitation events we see, those are becoming more likely due to us. That matters because those are the ones that you need to plan to. And this perhaps doesn't matter as much to this audience, but this is, on the horizontal axis, is how much we emit today, which is a reasonable proxy for historical responsibility. And on the vertical axis is how vulnerable people are. Okay, so those most responsible, those on the right-hand side of this graph, are the least vulnerable. Those in the global south who have the least historic responsibility are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. That does include global south farmers, and we do have a food system that is increasingly globalized. Key point 3, things will get rapidly worse if we do nothing. So here is how much the annual hottest day of the year would change at different warming levels. And you'll note that all it does really is, as you go through the scale here, the hue gets increasingly dark. So warming we see today becomes progressively more. The impacts we're already experiencing will get worse the further we warm the climate system. And the annual wettest day precipitation change shows similar things. Regions that are already getting wetter will get wetter and wetter and wetter. Areas that are getting drier, and they're few and far between, will continue to get drier. Future climate change will also have demonstrable impact upon food production. These are all figures, by the way, from the IPCC, all figures actually that have been approved by every government in the world, so they have some standing. These are how much maize yield and fisheries yield would change. Some areas are winners, but there are far more areas that are losers in the game of climate change in terms of agricultural productivity. Key point 4, if we want to keep climate change at 1.5 with minimal or no overshoot, it requires everything, everywhere, all at once. If we'd started taking climate change seriously in 1990, if instead of increasing emissions for the last 30-odd years, we'd even kept them stable, we would have a cornucopia of options to keep warming well below 2 degrees centigrade. The fact that we have dilly-dallied means we do not. The green and the blue curve are what it looks like to go limit warming to 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees each in here. And the red curve is what we currently are committed to as a global community. The key message here is that to reach a stable climate, we must reduce CO2 emissions, the long-lived reservoir greenhouse gas, to net zero, and actually net negative by the middle of the century. We must also simultaneously reduce methane emissions by about half on that timescale. That equates to zeroing the fossil fuel emissions methane and reducing the agricultural methane, but there is no scenario, plausible scenario, in which methane reaches zero, okay? The net zero world is the world of residual methane and nitrous oxide emissions, reduced but still there, and net negative CO2. And there are different ways that we can achieve this. There is no single way. This is where the politicians and the policymakers and everyone in global society comes in. We can meet net zero in multiple different ways. Which way we do it depends upon us. Key point 5 is we have the technologies, tools and policy instruments to act, and many return money to our pockets. So in this graph, anything that's blue on a levelized cost of expenditure, in other words, if we invest the money today, we would net get money back into our pockets, into citizens' pockets in the end. Okay, and if you were in Europe or somewhere with a carbon tax like Ireland, then most of the yellow and the orange similarly puts money back in your pocket. And there are options in every single sector. And some of these options really should be considered by the agricultural sector in terms of diversification and sustainability of income. Solar on the tops of the milking sheds is a diversification of income potential that could actually support farmers. Key point 6 is a really important one. Not acting on climate makes acting on everything else that matters to us much, much harder. So the next graph I'm going to show will show all of the sustainable development goals, all of the things that globally we've agreed we want, all of the things that any sane human wants, better education, better healthcare, etc., etc. And I'm going to have, each bar will have colour. Some will be blue, some will be orange, some will be white. White means we know nothing. Orange means we know if we act on climate, it will be harder to meet that sustainable development goal. And blue means if we act on climate, it becomes easier to meet that sustainable development goal. Right, so that was enough of the spoilers. This has a lot of blue, guys, okay? If we don't act on climate, we make it that much harder to act on everything we actually care about, perhaps. Even if you do not care about climate, you should care about it because the things that matter to you become much harder to achieve without meaningful action on climate. Key point 7 is climate change is personal to all of us. I always put this in for a national audience because this was actually a figure we dreamt up in Dublin in the basement of one of the hotels in the lead author meeting that we had for the synthesis report. It has had massive cut through. I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'd like to invite up our next speaker now, Professor Conor Murphy from the Department of Geography at Maynooth University.
So thank you very much indeed. Thanks, Peter, for setting the scene. Thanks to the organisers for the opportunity to speak today. I want to focus attention back onto this island in a bit more detail, but also to think about the impacts of climate change and what we can do to adapt. Much of the discussion today, and there's some excellent science, excellent conversations happening, it's about mitigation. It's reducing greenhouse gas emissions to meet Ireland's obligations. A key part of climate action is adaptation. And as Peter said, farming, the sector, is right at the very forefront of the impacts of climate change. No other livelihood is more influenced by the weather conditions from day to day, season to season, and year to year. So the impacts and adaptation to climate change needs to begin to emerge higher up on the policy agenda, and I want to indicate why. So I'm going to keep this focus on key messages. When we come to climate conferences, we're often talking about future climate change. My key message number 1 is that climate change is happening. It's here, it's now. It's not for future generations or future decades. We can discern the signal of climate change here in Ireland, in temperature, in rainfall, and in key impacts. The last number of years, we have seen remarkable change at a global scale. 2023, for example, was at the time the warmest year on record in this field of research. Records get updated pretty quickly. You can see on the left-hand side how remarkably different 2023 was. It lays out individual months throughout the year. The red line is 2023, and from about midsummer onwards to the end of the year was head and shoulders above any other month that was recorded back to 1940s in this case. That didn't last long. 2024 came along and it is now the world's warmest observed year on record and was the first year to exceed the 1.5 degree threshold, so important to the Paris Agreement. And it wasn't just remarkable at a global scale. Here in Ireland, for example, 2023 was our warmest year on record. You can see again at the end of the graph on the top right-hand side how much warmer it was than previous years. And even 2024, while not reaching the peaks that it did globally, is within the top 5 warmest years recorded on Ireland, getting back to the 1900s or thereabouts. The chances of 7 of the top 10 warmest years occurring from 2005 by chance is minuscule if you're into betting. And it was also in 2023 the wettest year on record according to Met Éireann's dataset. And we saw the impacts of that most vividly, I think, in the public imagination here in Ireland of the floods in Middleton that happened on the tail of Storm Babbitt in October 2023. And we are now able to show that the impacts, that flood event was made more likely as a result of greenhouse gas emissions from climate change. It's increased the likelihood of the 2-day heavy rainfall events that gave rise to flooding and has increased the chances of occurrence by 13%. And it's not just in Middleton. We've been working at Maynooth University with Med Éireann and others in order to look at the emergence of a climate change signal in Irish records. This is just for rainfall intensity. And all of those blue triangles across the island are stations across our country where we see the emergence of a climate change signal in heavy rainfall events. A warmer atmosphere holds more moisture and as a result delivers heavier rainfall. And the increase in intensity is happening just about at the rate that we expect due to physics. In terms of temperature, the climate change signal is much clearer. If you were farming in Ireland at the beginning of the 19th century, you would now be experiencing a climate in many parts of the country that is unusual and in some parts of the country unfamiliar. Many people talk about Ireland experiencing a reduced impact of climate change, but our observations show us that many of the parts of the country, those triangles in red, for example, are experiencing a rate of warming higher than the global mean rate of warming. My key message too is that the agricultural sector is vulnerable and needs to adapt. I don't need to tell you about vulnerability. I had to reduce this slide because I could have filled it from newspaper cuttings of the impacts of climate change, but just focus on one. The end of 2023 in my own county of Wexford, harvest was left in the ground throughout large parts of the south of the county because of trafficability problems, because of rainfall intensity, increasing crop quality and yield. We look back a couple of years to 2018 and the drought impacts that we saw. Droughts have occurred right throughout history. We expect them to become more intense, more extreme from changing rainfall and increased temperature. We talked about, at the time, many people saying we've often had drought. Yes, we did in the 1970s, but take a step back in the map on the left-hand side and place 2018 in context. It's happening in a much warmer world. In terms of my third key message, the future impacts of climate change will be more severe. We're seeing the impacts emerge, we're seeing the signal emerge, but the future depends on how much greenhouse gas emissions that we emit. But it's equally important to say that even if we stopped all greenhouse gas emissions today, we will still be experiencing the impacts of climate change for decades to come. So we need to emphasise adaptation as well as mitigation. What does this mean for Ireland? Well, temperature warms everywhere. For rainfall, on a seasonal basis, we're likely to see wetter winters and drier summers with continued greenhouse gas emissions. The blue colours are towards wetter winters on the left-hand side, and the right-hand side is towards the signal of drier summers. The key finding from this graph is that the earlier we reduce emissions, the less severe future impacts will be. If we have a look at changes in future drought, for example, these are looking at changes in seasonal droughts. I've highlighted in red spring and summer, where you see the emergence of these really red dots. That's looking at increasing intensity of droughts. Really important for a grass-based agriculture system, particularly spring drought for grass growth and yield into summer. More drought means reduced yield. And that's driven not just by precipitation change, but increased evaporative losses. And one way for you as individuals to think about future climate change is to think about memorable seasonal extremes. What did it mean for your farm? What did it mean for your sector? If we have a look, for example, at our driest and hottest summer on record, 1995, and fast forward to the end of the century in a business as usual world, the hottest year on record would be a rare event, would be considered as cool, and a year as cool as 1995 would only occur once every 7 years. If we think about the driest summer on record, about 1 in 8 years being as dry as 1995. And similarly for the wettest winter on record, that happening on average once every 7 to 8 years. Again, thinking about what that means for your sector. In terms of key impacts, there are many in the agricultural sector. People often talk about an opportunity from climate change being increased grass growth and growing season length. Yes, warmer temperatures will increase the growing season, but we need to put that in the context of trafficability and increased rainfall in winter. We need to put that in the context of reductions in grass growth during summer when it's needed as a result of water stress. We need to think about pests and pathogens, both for livestock and for our crops, the overwintering of aphids, the introduction of new diseases, and how we can be more resilient to the kinds of changes that are likely to come down the track. My last key message, number 4, is that Ireland needs to be resilient to climate change. We have a national climate objective that puts front and centre realising a climate resilient Ireland by 2050. Agriculture is a core part of Ireland's economy. It's part of our culture, it's key livelihood, it's part of our urban and our rural livelihoods. So we need to really focus on investing in the resilience and adapting this sector to climate change and moving the attention going forward with all the great work on mitigation and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but learning from recent extremes to understand where the adaptation barriers are. How can we support the well-being of farmers? From 2018 and a 15% reduction in incomes, what are the lessons we can learn about working together in order to become more resilient in responding to extremes? And as part of the Climate Change Advisory Council Committee on Adaptation, that's what we're trying to do in working together with sectors in order to help in developing sectoral adaptation plans. And what does success look like when it comes to realising a climate resilient Ireland? It needs buy-in and a shared set of objectives. What's the target that we're working to? What does an agricultural sector that's resilient look like in the face of increasing extremes? How do we ensure just adaptation and resilience, that everybody is brought along on the journey and people are not left behind, particularly in terms of our farming population, older, smallholder farmers versus larger, younger farmers? How do we monitor and evaluate? We're doing lots of good work in terms of monitoring yields, in terms of monitoring emissions. How do we monitor the impacts of our investments in adaptation in terms of outcomes? And how do we work with people and nature? Farmers in the agricultural sector are really important stewards of our landscape and of our environment. There are lots of clever things that we can do that offer win-win opportunities. Multi-species swards might be beneficial for mitigation, but can they also be beneficial for drought resilience? When we think about land management and making room for rivers, for example, or nature-based approaches to help reduce the impacts of flooding. So we all need to work together. Agriculture is crucial to all sectors in the Irish economy, not just to the sector itself. And we need to make decisions under uncertainty. Farmers are used to doing that every day, every season, making decisions. How do we leverage that expertise, support that in terms of science and innovation to help those decision making and maintain flexibility in ensuring a climate resilient Ireland for the future? Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Conor. Thanks to both of our speakers, Professor Peter Thorne and Professor Conor Murphy. And I'd now like to welcome to the stage Martin Heydon TD, Minister for Agriculture, Food and the Marine.
Thank you very much, Helen. Taoiseach, Minister Grealish, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I am delighted to welcome you here today to the Agriculture and Climate Change Science into Action Conference, an initiative of the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. It is a particular privilege to welcome you, Taoiseach, here today to open our proceedings, a clear signal of the Government's commitment to both climate action and the future of Irish agriculture. I'm also pleased to welcome such a diverse audience from right across the sector, and especially our international delegates, who have joined us following their attendance at a meeting of the Global Research Alliance for Agricultural Greenhouse Gases here in Dublin Castle earlier this week. Ireland, through my department, is chairing the Alliance this year, and we are delighted you could join us to further develop our strong international collaboration in this important area. The interest in the turnout here today demonstrates the seriousness with which our sector takes the challenges of reducing emissions from agriculture in order to play our part in the fight against global warming. I have always said farmers can't go green if they're in the red. To bring farmers with us on this journey, they need a roadmap that is rooted in robust science, one that stacks up economically and environmentally, and that's what today's conference is all about. There is no doubt that the climate challenge we face is very significant, and that climate change is already impacting us, as we saw earlier this year with Storm Owen. Today's conference is an opportunity to maintain and build on the good work being done by our researchers, farmers, advisors, innovators, and many others in the sector. Providing a forum like this demonstrates our commitment to supporting knowledge exchange, showcasing our research, and ensuring it informs practical farming solutions and future policy developments. As discussions on the future of agricultural policy across Europe begin in earnest, we must continue to be a leader and advocate for climate-smart farming, while also delivering on the growing need to increase food supply and security. Research and science are the bedrock to this. It is why we have put it at the heart of today's conference and why we have assembled leading scientists to set out the latest developments in relation to reducing greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. We will also hear from those tasked with ensuring the outputs of that research reaches farmers. And I'm particularly looking forward to hearing from farmers themselves on what they are doing on their farms to address the challenge of climate change. Delegates, I will speak to you in more detail at the close of the conference this afternoon, but for now I just want to reiterate that the transition to a more sustainable agri-food system will require research, innovation, cooperation and coordinated action, and the onus is on everyone to act. I hope that today we can come together in a collective spirit of optimism and determination to fulfil this ambition. Finally, I want to extend again my appreciation to Taoiseach for taking the time to be with us here today. Your presence is further evidence of government's commitment to combating climate change and ensuring a vibrant, sustainable agri-food and forest sector. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome you now to the podium to officially open the conference, Taoiseach.
Martin agus Gwynisiach le bramar dúspáidem of Wacus Gwail de Martin agus Gachgéine tá fragor gasok agrúin léanúh Quigvor Chogáil is ceist Lorna ché ceist an a hochtach agus is privilege dumsa ve I láthir live mar Taoiseach na tíre. Just want to thank Minister Heydon for the invitation to be with you all here this morning at this very important conference, because today and indeed the last few days has been an opportunity for policymakers, researchers, industry and farming representatives, non-governmental organisations and civil society to talk about the shared challenge of climate change and to explore the use of science-based solutions as part of our approach to meeting this challenge. Few sectors are as central to both our national identity and our climate ambitions as agriculture. Irish farming is not only a key pillar of our economy, especially in our rural communities, but it's also a sector that can have an unparalleled influence, positive and negative, on the natural world around us, on the quality of our water, our biodiversity, and on our climate. The agri-food sector is Ireland's oldest and largest indigenous exporting sector. In 2024, Irish agri-food exports were valued at over €19 billion, reaching over 180 countries and accounting for nearly 9% of Ireland's total goods exports. The sector employs 169,000 plus people across more than 135,000 farms, 2,000 fishing vessels and aquaculture sites, and over 2,000 food production and drink enterprises. And this represents about 6.1% of the total workforce. So these figures underscore the sector's significance, not just economically, but crucially also socially and culturally. And we're here today to talk about the shared challenge that is climate change, how agriculture can help us to tackle it through lowering its emissions, and how agriculture can adapt to its worst impacts. And the people in this room know better than most that climate change is not a distant threat. It is already changing the seasonal patterns that we in Ireland have relied upon for millennia to successfully grow crops, rear livestock and make a living from the land. So climate change is here and now and is having impact. More frequent and more intense storms, prolonged dry spells, unpredictable growing seasons and increased disease pressures are becoming the new normal. These changes threaten productivity, animal welfare and the sustainability of family farms, especially in vulnerable areas. The interaction of land use and climate impacts are becoming more of a focus as we deepen our understanding, and Ireland must collectively protect itself as the climate continues to change. These are not just environmental concerns, they are economic and societal ones, not least for farming communities that are particularly exposed to climatic unpredictability. Employment levels, output rates and income from farming are crucially important for the country, but so too is the impact of the sector on the climate and on the natural world in which we live. Indeed, the sector accounts for more than a third of Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions. This puts the sector in a challenging position where it is both vulnerable to climate impacts and central to Ireland's efforts to quickly reduce our contribution to climate change. A recent ESRI report reinforces what many of us already know. Farmers, like most Irish people, are deeply concerned about climate change. They take it into account in their farming and they are ready to take action. For farming, climate, nature and water quality have become central considerations and will remain so over the coming decades. Improving agriculture's environmental performance while maintaining a vibrant agri-food sector and protecting farm incomes is what we must strive for. And it is crucial that we embrace rather than recoil from these challenges, that we face with honesty and without fear the potential implications and opportunities that they present for our farming practices, for land use and for rural communities. And we need to engage positively and look together at how Irish agriculture can continue to thrive in these new and changed realities. And I attended last week the Dairy Gold Quality Awards in Mallow, and I saw it firsthand through the many presentations, the extraordinary lengths that farmers are going at farm level to dealing with this issue, right across the board, from biodiversity to water quality to good husbandry and so forth. And it was wonderful to witness it in terms of the various presentations from the Taoiseach representatives and those who had visited the farms, and the presentations involved interviews and videos and so on with the farm families who had received awards or who were nominated for awards. And agriculture and farming is one of the few sectors in society where it's really down to sort of the individual farm level or business level where such an intense interaction with these issues is actually taking place. To a certain extent, compared to other disciplines in life or to other areas of life, farming is actually taking on a significant responsibility, and sometimes that's not acknowledged in the broader narrative around this particular theme or this particular issue. And I think that needs to be acknowledged more. From my own personal witness and having engaged with farming families, they are dealing with this on a daily basis and seeking out new mechanisms to enable them to change and to adapt and to deal with the change that is coming. Now, part of the action required includes stepping up to one of the real challenges that we face, and that's the quality of our water. And water quality is vital to the well-being of our society, our economy and environment, and particularly as our rivers, lakes and groundwater are the sources of our drinking water. The programme for government makes it absolutely clear regarding and gives clear commitments regarding water quality and the nitrates derogation. I'm chairing a new Cabinet Committee on water quality to coordinate across government water quality improvements. And I understand how important to agriculture, to farming and to the country the nitrates derogation is. It comes up again and again in my discussions with the farming sector. As a government, we're working hard at EU level to ensure the best outcome for Ireland and Irish farming. However, securing a continuation of the derogation will not be without its challenges. And I spoke to the President of the Commission recently on this and other issues pertaining to agriculture. And while there is encouraging water quality data for 2023, and that is acknowledged at European level, we still have a lot of work to do to ensure that water quality and the principal derogation catchments improves sufficiently. I am encouraged by how the entire agri-food industry is now very much engaged, and there is a very real desire to tackle this issue in a meaningful way. I've heard this firsthand from representatives from across farming communities. The Farming for Water European Innovation Partnership is backed by a €60 million investment by the state, launched last year, and supports actions to improve water quality in our most vulnerable catchments. It is led by LawPro, the local authority's waters programme, working in partnership with our farmers, Taoiseach and Dairy Industry Ireland. We need to see continued and sustained change in water quality practices across all sectors. Agriculture, yes, but also forestry and wastewater treatment. We must all work together to safeguard our thriving agricultural sector and ensure that prospects for affected farm families remain good for years to come. And this can only be achieved by us successfully reducing the adverse impact on the water in which we all depend. This push for better water will also support our climate and biodiversity ambitions. And we've already seen, as I've said, significant efforts from farmers to improve environmental performance, from implementing low-emission slurry spreading techniques, to planting hedgerows, to improving genetic efficiency in herds, to participating in agri-environmental schemes. These are not small changes. They are proof of a willingness to lead, not lag, in the transition to a more sustainable model of farming. And yet we must all acknowledge that we are not where we need to be. Ireland has accepted challenging emissions reduction targets at EU and national levels, and we have considerable work to do to achieve what we have committed to. Latest projections show that the agriculture sector, like almost all sectors, has more work to do. Reducing greenhouse emissions is essential to protect this generation of farmers, while also future-proofing the sector for those who will follow. Recent signs have been positive, with agriculture emissions falling by 4.6% in 2023 relative to 2022. And this is the largest single-year reduction observed in the sector. In addition, nitrogen fertiliser use fell by 18% in 2023. I'm encouraged by the efforts, as I said, of farmers to realise these reductions, but we must all work together to achieve greater and more sustained reductions in the coming years. The theme of today's conference of putting science into action is very appropriate, as science and technology, including the potential use of AI, will be critical allies in meeting our targets. And by the way, it's very interesting at the Young Scientists competition every year, which is on around January for those not in the country. It's the best event in the country, from my perspective, and the most optimistic week of the year, because we get to see our young scientists and the potential that's there. But I'm always struck by the number of entries from rural Ireland and agricultural backgrounds in the Young Scientists competition, who are actually engaging with these challenges, not fazed by them, very aware of them, and seeking solutions in the projects that they submit to the competition. And I think that emphasis on science is key to us as a country dealing with these challenges, because ultimately what we do must be evidence-based and must be rooted in science. The countries that came through COVID-19 the best were those that relied on science and were very adhered to the principles of science and to the fundamental centrality of science in terms of evidence-based public policy. And it has to be the same approach in the context of climate change, because climate change is a shared global challenge. And in addition to the research being undertaken by Taoiseach and the department, we have to leverage the best science and expertise from around the world. We are already seeing results. Feed additives and manure management technologies that reduce methane emissions from ruminants are showing strong potential. Breeding strategies for lower methane emitting animals are progressing. New fertilisers and precision application technologies are helping reduce nitrous oxide emissions from soils. Digital tools, from satellite monitoring to smart collars and precision livestock management systems, are making it possible to monitor emissions and productivity at the farm level in real time. Ireland is also playing a leading role in the European Union's Carbon Farming Initiative, which rewards farmers for the carbon they remove from the atmosphere through improved land management. We are also seeing very useful research in the areas of adaptation that will be crucial for Irish agriculture to adjust as the climate changes further. But science doesn't implement itself, and that's where policy and partnership come in. The government is fully aware that making these changes is not and will not be easy. It requires time, money, new knowledge, and in many cases, changes to long-established practices. And that is why the government is committed to supporting farmers with real and practical help. We are providing a suite of financial and advisory supports. Acres is rewarding over 46,000 farmers for undertaking actions that protect biodiversity, water quality and climate. The Targeted Agricultural Modernisation Scheme offers grant aid of up to 60% for equipment and facilities that reduce emissions or improve animal welfare. The Organic Farming Scheme continues to support the transition to organic systems with enhanced payments and training supports. Knowledge transfer groups delivered through Taoiseach and private advisors are helping farmers access the latest science and practical know-how. And through the new soil sampling and analysis programme, we are building a national baseline to support carbon farming and targeted nutrient management. I understand that there are concerns, that the pace of change can feel overwhelming, that some of the narratives around farming and climate action can seem unfair or overly simplistic. But let me assure you that the government does not underestimate the complexity of the issues or the challenges that the change can bring. But we cannot ignore the consequences of inaction. If we do not act with resolve now, our climate will force us to adapt later, and at much greater cost to our land, our incomes and our communities. And that is why we must proceed through partnership, grounded in objective science, guided by fairness and shaped by the experience of those on the ground. This is about building a shared path forward that ensures the next generation of farmers inherits not only a livable planet, but also a thriving, competitive and respected agricultural sector. I want to thank all of you for your efforts so far and your engagement and indeed your openness to what comes next. The transition to climate-smart agriculture does not need to be a burden. It's a chance to safeguard what matters most: our land, our water, our food, our planet and our future. It is a chance to show that climate action and agricultural excellence can go hand in hand, and that Irish farmers can lead the way. I would ask you to use today to go forward without fear, to grasp the opportunities to be leaders in the fight against climate change while continuing to produce world-class food. The government and the Irish people are fully behind you in this endeavour. As the old Irish proverb or shanachal says, Ní nart go cur le chéile, gur míle maithagubh go léir.
Thank you very much, Taoiseach, and thank you also to Minister Heydon. We now have a pre-recorded message for you. While this message is playing, I might ask the next speakers for session 2 to make their way to the stage now as well, please. So we have a message from European Commissioner for Agriculture and Food, Christophe Hansen.
Ladies and gentlemen, climate change is challenging for farmers across Europe, including in Ireland. This challenge also involves the need to adapt agriculture practices to help mitigate the adverse effects that climate change has on farming businesses. It is very welcome to see Irish farmers address the challenge of climate change with innovative new ways to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. In the livestock sector, for example, new technologies and practices are being applied to reduce methane emissions. This includes improved animal breeding technologies to reduce ammonia, use of feed additives, better manure management, and reduced application of nitrogen fertilizers. These new, effective and progressive practices are yielding positive results. Provisional data shows that greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture fell in Ireland by 4.6% in 2023. The Common Agriculture Policy supports a further lowering of greenhouse gas emissions in Irish agriculture by promoting sustainable farming practices that reduce environmental impact while safeguarding farming businesses. We should also maintain the policy toolbox in the future CAP. I was happy to visit Ireland in January this year, very early in my mandate as EU Agriculture Commissioner, when I could see for myself how important farming and agriculture is to the country overall. I am glad to see that Ireland is an innovative and reliable player in its approach to tackling greenhouse gas emission within agriculture. I wish you a very successful conference. Thank you very much for your attention.
And thank you to Commissioner Hansen for sending us that message. We're moving on to session 2 now, agricultural and land use emissions, insights from Ireland and New Zealand. I'll remind you again to use Slido, the QR code, if you want to submit any questions, and time permitting we'll get through as many of them as we can. I'll introduce our first speaker of this session, Laura Burke, Director General, the EPA.
Good morning, and thank you very much for the invite to speak today. For those of you who may not know the Environmental Protection Agency, we've key roles in regulation, knowledge provision and working with others to deliver better environmental outcomes. And for the EPA, we're all about the data, the science and the evidence. So great to be here today as part of these discussions. And of course, Ireland's natural environment not only has an intrinsic value in its own right, it is also a key strategic asset for the country. It's core to healthy lives, to national competitiveness, and to successful businesses. With regard to climate change, the EPA has many roles, but today I'm going to focus really on inventories and projections, where we're at and where we see we're going to go with regard to agricultural emissions. So, where are we at? Our latest figures are for 2023, and that indicates that Ireland emitted just under 55 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. This was a great reduction of 6.8% versus 2022, so I think we were all celebrating this really significant reduction in emissions pretty much across all sectors. And Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions were at their lowest level in over 3 decades. The agriculture sector, of course, is key to this. It is the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in Ireland, accounting for approximately 40% of all emissions. The transport and energy sectors are third and largest, with just over 20% and 15% respectively. All of this excludes land use change and forestry, but when we include that, emissions from land account for almost 7% of total national emissions, which highlights the importance of land as we look forward. Moving specifically then to agricultural emissions, and the key drivers, as you're all aware, are the size of the national cattle herd and application rates of nitrogen fertiliser. While both have increased over the last decade, there has been stabilisation in animal numbers in recent years and significant reductions in fertiliser use, I should say chemical fertiliser use. Going back to 1990, we see that there was a rising trend in greenhouse gas emissions in the 1990s, with emissions starting to steadily decrease between 1998 until 2011. Following 2011, emissions have trended upwards with an overall peak in emissions in 2021, driven largely by the expansion of the dairy industry. In the last 10 years, dairy cow numbers have increased by 41%, and there has been a corresponding increase in milk production of 56%. In the same 10-year period, sheep numbers and pig numbers also increased. In 2023, emissions from agriculture decreased by almost 5%, a decrease in use of synthetic nitrogen fertiliser. Livestock numbers decreased in general, non-dairy cattle in sheep and in pigs, but dairy cow numbers increased marginally again. Looking then to methane emissions, which are of course key, we have seen an increase in methane emissions over the years. 72% share of emissions, of agricultural emissions in 2023 versus 69% back in 1990, though again a decrease between 2022 and 2023. And I was asked today if I could give some indication of what's happening with regard to 2024. And the EPA will be producing our greenhouse gas inventory later in June, early July. But we have started producing quarterly indicators with regard to greenhouse gas emissions, as well as nitrates in waters, so that we can have the most up-to-date information at any point in time to support policy making. And what we're seeing with regard to this is, while welcome the emission reductions in 2023 have not been sustained and embedded in the sector. The data shows that the agriculture sector will not repeat the same level of emissions in 2023 as in 2023 and 2024, with early data showing a marginal increase in emissions associated with mainly increased nitrogen fertiliser use, which was up 15%. It's also notable when we compare Q4 2023 or Q4 2024 to Q4 2023 that emissions are up in that last quarter by 3.8%. There's increased methane emissions from dairy cows driven by increased milk production. So unfortunately what we're seeing, and I would indicate that these are just indicators, but we're seeing 2024, we're seeing that marginal increase. It is indicators, but the way we've produced our indicators do show a close correlation with the ultimate inventory that we produce. Where are we going then with regard to emissions? Last week, as many of you will be aware, the EPA published our greenhouse gas projections for the period up to 2025. We're projecting a reduction of up to 23% in total emissions compared to a national target of 51%, and is also indicating that we won't meet our effort sharing regulation target of a 42% reduction. In addition, we're seeing that emissions from land could increase by up to 95%, depending on measures taken. With regard to agriculture, total emissions from agriculture are projected to increase by 1%, or under, I suppose I would refer to it as the best case scenario, where all planned policies and measures are implemented and deliver in full, we could see a decrease in emissions of 16% versus a target of 25%. And there are very significant assumptions within that, including, for example, that all slurry stores will be covered by 2027, that the fertiliser sales ceilings will be met. It doesn't, however, include things like diversification measures in agriculture, which could have savings of up to 1.5 million tonnes. The reason that isn't included is that there isn't an implementation pathway that the EPA can incorporate into our projections. And we would hope that this can be addressed in the coming months. We need to scale up implementation. As I said, savings are projected from a variety of measures, including limiting usage and switching to different types of chemical fertilisers, methane reduction measures and water table management. Further measures still need to be identified and implemented to achieve sector emission reduction commitments, but there is a lot of known actions, as has been already highlighted, that we can implement now. Moving, I suppose, finally to land use, and I'd indicated that at the beginning of my presentation, that land use is a significant sector. It is a net source of emissions for all years. There has been a considerable long-term decline in the area of land afforested annually, an increase in the level of harvest and increased emissions from forestry on organic soils, resulting in a reduction of the contribution of forest land sector to the removal of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. In addition, afforestation rates have declined from approximately 17,000 hectares annually in the 1990s to 1,650 hectares in 2023. This is resulting in a decrease in carbon sink in the land converted to forest. And we're seeing that there potentially will be a tipping point shortly where forestry will no longer be a sink but a source of emissions. There is a high level of ambition with regard to use of our land, and actions such as afforestation, rewetting, renewable energy, increased organics and tillage have the potential of land use activities to remove carbon from the atmosphere and supporting moving the sector from being a net source to a sink. So finally, going forward, the EPA absolutely recognises that as a nation we have a clear cultural, social and economic interdependency on agriculture and land. It is important to recognise and support Ireland's rural communities, many of whom will be called upon to make personal changes and investments to implement change within their farming enterprises in response to the low-carbon transition. The agriculture sector has a key role in delivering on and depending on a healthy environment. We know many of the solutions that need to be implemented, and these need to be rolled out, and support for farmers is necessary. We will need further emission reductions and research and innovation to achieve reductions in emerging areas such as feed additives and new fertilisers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura, for that sobering presentation. Our next speaker now is Stephanie Preston. Stephanie's Director of Programmes and Planning in Policy and Trade with the New Zealand Ministry for Primary Industries.
Thank you and good morning. Tēnā koutou katoa. My name's Stephanie Preston and I'm really honoured to be here. We were asked to talk a little bit about emissions trends and policies in New Zealand, and I mean already from my few days in Ireland and the presentations that we've had this morning, you realise how much we have in common, so many of the common challenges and common values about how we want to tackle those challenges. So just to start off, a quick comparison of your emissions profile and ours, both heavily dominated by agriculture. Agriculture represents about 53% of our emissions. Partly that's driven by the fact that we were lucky enough to have a really good source of hydropower, so our energy sector is also relatively decarbonised, but nevertheless we're an agricultural country and methane and nitrous oxide is the largest source of our emissions. It's also the centrepiece of our economy. We always say the backbone of our economy. 50% of our goods exports are from the dairy, beef and sheep sector, and so any discussion that we have around agriculture emissions is also a discussion about trade in our economy. So here is a brief and more simple than Laura's graph on trends in our agricultural emissions. So essentially since the 1990s our emissions tracked up steadily, peaked around 2014, we call that our peak cow, and then remained relatively steady through to around 2020. In the early 2020s, our emissions started to drop, and that was driven by a few things. So reduced use of synthetic fertiliser was one of the big drivers. That was partially a freshwater issues and partially the cost of fertiliser. But primarily the biggest driver of our emissions reductions has been the change in land use. So in New Zealand we have an emissions trading scheme. Around 25% of our emissions are offset through carbon forestry, and those carbon credits offset other parts of the economy. In the price of carbon has driven up the incentive to convert land to forestry, and that conversion, that increase in conversion has been quite marked. So in 2015 there were about, check my notes, I think 4,000 hectares that were converted into carbon farming. In 2023, 78,000 hectares were converted into carbon farming. So that was the largest jump since the 1990s. The price of carbon in New Zealand has levelled off somewhat, but we still see land use change as a big driver in the reduction of emissions. That's not without downsides. So for competition with productive land, social and community impacts are part of that equation. This is our just a graph, again a simple graph of our long-term projections. Overall, we have a net zero target, but in New Zealand we have a split gas approach. So within our overall net zero target, we have a specific target for methane. We're aiming to reduce our methane by 10% by 2030, so less ambitious than you, and a 24 to 47% reduction by 2050. At the moment, our projections are that we're on track to meet both our 2030 and our 2050 targets, but like you, that that depends on us taking all of the policy decisions that we need to take over that time and the implementation of the technologies that we'll talk about more today. Like you, we have independent bodies, and the emissions trading scheme is the central policy lever that we have to reduce emissions in our country. So we've been on a bit of a policy journey. For those of you that have followed, emissions pricing of agriculture has been something that's been on and off the table since probably 2005, 2006. Most recently in our first official emissions reduction plan in 2022. With our current coalition government, we've taken a step, not necessarily a step back, but taken more time to get there. So the government's still committed to a fair and sustainable pricing system by 2030, but we couldn't implement a pricing system ahead of there being effective tools and mechanisms that farmers could use to reduce emissions. So while the government remains committed, this approach allows more time for the tools to be developed, to mature, for them to be affordable, and to work within New Zealand farm systems. So rather than a pricing-led approach, this is a technology-led approach. Massive increase in funding into technology. So this graph is a combination of Crown funding and private sector funding that we've managed to crowd into this collective effort. We have two major delivery mechanisms for our technology-led approach into climate change. So one is Agri-Zero. Agri-Zero is a private public company that we established with our largest agribusinesses, including Fonterra, and 4 of our major banks. And this is a 50-50 company. It's a venture and accelerator fund, and through Agri-Zero, we're pursuing investments in new technologies that can be scaled up and commercialised for New Zealand farmers. In 2 years, they've shot out of the gates flying, have 9 investments in promising technologies, including vaccines and inhibitors. Alongside Agri-Zero, our other key lever is the New Zealand Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Research Centre, which is our primary centre for foundational and pre-competitive research. Today we have Dr. Harry Clark here, who is our chief scientist, so he'll talk a bit more about the science later this afternoon. Again, for the NZAGRC, we've seen it critical to both step up the funding and support that independent organisation to have a very targeted and very mission-led and focused long-term research program. And finally, just a quick counter through, a shout out to our international partners, GRA, bilateral partners, and particularly I want to highlight the support that we've had from Ireland, from Minister Heydon and others around our joint research program. Through that program, we've been able to combine our powers and have had 11 projects funded across 14 institutions, and really seen the benefit of international collaboration to go faster and get there quicker, really. So a quick canter through the New Zealand experience. Thanks.
Very much, Stephanie. The questions are flying in through Slido, which is great to see, and I would encourage you to keep asking questions, and I can put them to the panellists. I notice nobody ever sits right beside me, but I won't take it personally. One of the first questions that has come through on Slido from Owen Cashman, and I'll put it to you, Stephanie, is what factors influence the price paid for carbon in your emissions trading scheme in New Zealand?
So before we start, I have to say that the emissions trading scheme in New Zealand gets quite technical, and the accounting and the rules around it.
Keep it simple.
Yes, but I will say, I don't want to steer you wrong.
Okay.
We have, there's an auction, there's a price floor, and then if it really is, it's a market, so if people are willing to pay the price and at the auction, then that's what it gets sold for. We have a secondary carbon market as well, where there's a market price of around 50 New Zealand dollars a tonne for carbon. So it's a controlled market.
Okay, great. There's another question has come in from Stuart G. How do we close the gap between research and scaling? So we have proven technologies and practices, and we're going to hear more about that later on today. So is it just about incentivising it? I mean, if it's there, how do we get it implemented, ideally, Laura?
And I think that, look, this is always a particular challenge, but I know there's an awful lot of work being done by the likes of Teagasc and others to move from that kind of idea to then kind of testing at a farm level and then giving the confidence, I suppose, to the community. And of course, and it's already been identified this morning, investment in moving up to scale. But I think some of it will be confidence that things work. So that initial research, that initial trialling, I think is really important.
And it was interesting, sticking with investment, what you were mentioning about some of the funds that you mentioned there, where some banks and large agri-food companies are investing in it. And does that speed up bringing the research and technologies that are there into real-world practice?
That's certainly what we're hoping. So by having our largest companies, dairy processors, agribusinesses and the banks that fund them and the government at the table, figuring out together how the commercial incentives, the financing incentives and the policy incentives all line up to get earlier adoption. That's the aim.
Okay, there's another question in, and I suppose it follows on from what even the Taoiseach said in his speech about AI being there as a tool that can be used. But are we paying enough attention to supports and research into biological and ecological solutions to deal with climate change rather than just technology coming to our rescue?
Well, I certainly know in the Irish case, there's funding across all aspects. And, you know, I was going to say even the EPA, but the EPA funds significant research in the policy side, but there's, of course, funding in the technology side. And I think the amount of funding and research that's going into the agriculture sector is absolutely enormous in Ireland, looking at, you know, from the science to implementation. Of course, you always need more, and there's always something further to be done. But that idea of having all of the stakeholders at the table to kind of to drive it forward and to support it as well, because ultimately you're going to need the industry to support the initial ideas.
Absolutely, and I suppose what struck me most with both presentations was the stark contrast between our best case scenario, according to the EPA, is 16%, to achieve 16% by 2030. Your best case scenario is to achieve the targets by 2030.
But of just 10%. So our target is less ambitious than yours.
And what is the target?
So our target is 10% by 2030 and between 24 and 47% by 2050 for methane. So we have a split gas approach.
Okay.
Net zero overall by 2050.
By 2050. Okay, and there's a question here about forests. So what type of forests does your carbon farming scheme incentivise? Are some trees better than others? And how does that compare to Ireland's non-native commercial forestry and boglands?
So in New Zealand, the emissions trading scheme is exotic forestry for us, so pine, essentially. Our native indigenous forests come under a different scheme, so it is incentivising exotic forestry. And to the point that an earlier question is there's a question about should we also be incentivising native afforestation at scale, given it brings all the biodiversity benefits as well.
Okay. I've time for one final question. I'm going to put it to you, Laura. As I said, your presentation was quite sobering. And if we look at, I suppose, emissions from land use and land use change, we're at a tipping point where forestry could become a source rather than a sink, you had said. Is one more worrying to you than the other?
In the context of?
In the context of, I suppose, what do we focus on? You know, I suppose ideally you'd say everything, both. But land use and land use change, agricultural land use and land use change.
I think land use is absolutely critical. We have a limited land base in Ireland, and we really need to make those critical decisions of what we're using our land for. There's many, even within the agriculture sector, there's lots of ambition for the land, whether it's afforestation, increased tillage, increased organics. You know, there's lots of ambition there, but there is a limited amount of land. Then you take into consideration energy, onshore wind, solar, etc. And I think that conversation about what are the priorities for our land use are going to be critical.
And the tools are there. I mean,
absolutely.
You were talking about even if we come to, you know, chemical fertiliser, the tools are there, but they're not being used really as widely as they should be.
Well, we've seen, look, and I think I am conscious that 2024, definitely the results weren't as positive as 2023. The tools are there. We've seen success. And just, I think we need to be careful that it isn't a disaster when things are a little bit worse, and we don't all celebrate and think everything's solved when we've one good year. It is making sure that we get that trends. And, we saw with fertiliser, the price went up and there was a reaction. We need to be, again, what's the appropriate amount of fertiliser so that it isn't a waste from economic perspective from farmers, and it isn't draining into the lands.
Yeah, and I suppose the impact then geopolitical events have on our environment in every aspect. Well, I'd like to thank both of our speakers, Stephanie Preston and Laura Burke. Thank you both very much for joining us. And we're going to move now into session 3. Here we're looking at consumer and market trends around the area of sustainability. I'd like to invite to the stage Jim O'Toole, CEO of Bórd Bia.
Good morning, Taoiseach, Minister, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Helen, and thank you to Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine colleagues for the opportunity to speak to you at this important conference this morning. As the title suggests succinctly, I'm going to try and attempt to bring some customer and consumer perspectives to today's proceedings and address some of the factors which are motivating both groups in the short term and currently. I think it's important that we take a moment just to remember that the motivations of the consumer, the shopper, differ from those of the customer, the buyer. The customers must balance demands and needs of their consumers, but equally the pressures placed on them by market influencers such as the supply chain itself and policymakers. We'll talk a little bit more about consumers in a moment. However, it's important from the beginning to remember that the consumer also wears two hats in this arena, their own personal needs and also that of being a good citizen. On the flip side, policy and policymakers are looking to support those citizen needs, whilst the supply chain is looking to work within the compliance landscape, but also meeting and capitalising on those personal consumer needs. This therefore throws up several competing pressures in the marketplace, not limited to this list, and of course not all of which are equal. However, all of these factors play a part in defining the operating and competitive landscape for in the marketplace. We don't have time to go into all of them this morning. However, I would like to touch on a couple of areas on either side of which currently are going to be more important in the short to medium term. I don't need to remind this audience that the EU Green Deal remains the central driver of European and national policy and legislation towards agriculture and food, which is currently being implemented or is on the horizon. The 9 key pillars each address a crucial aspect of sustainability and environmental protection, with the objective and aim of transforming the EU into a modern, resource-efficient and competitive economy. Despite some pushback, the EU Green Deal has made significant progress when it comes to legislation affecting the food sector. Broad regulatory initiatives like the Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive, CSRD, and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive have started to streamline the reporting approach and rigour of larger companies in particular. The regulatory initiatives that have faced the most pressure as part of the Green Deal and subsequently have been stalled or have been withdrawn are those that have directly affected farmers and require greater engagement with the sector to create workable and practical solutions. The two that I believe are going to be most transformative in terms of what we see and experience on our supermarket shelves is the Empowering Consumer for the Green Transition Directive and the Green Claims Directive. From a consumer point of view, these two directives are looking to deliver confidence to them and empower better choices. The Empowering the Consumer Directive has already been approved by the Commission and is due to be enacted across all markets, maybe as soon as September 2026. It focuses on the provision of reliable information about sustainability for the consumer to make more informed choices, and in particular, it looks to address false green claims and unclear sustainability labels. It also requires that traders must not display sustainability labels which are not based on a recognised certification scheme, and this has the power to be transformative in terms of current products on the market with very loose or ambiguous claims. From Ireland's point of view, this validates the time and investment that all of the supply chain in the agriculture and food sector have put into developing Origin Green, and it is founded because it is founded on a certification scheme and is evidence that and provides evidence that is independently verified. It is also envisaged that the Green Claims Directive would work in tandem with the empowering consumer legislation. The Green Claims Directive is currently in the final stage of the legislative process, undergoing the trilogue negotiations between Parliament, Council and the Commission. These negotiations, expected to continue until late this year, aim to finalise the directive's text and reconcile remaining differences. If adopted, it is expected the directive will become binding in 2027. The major requirement of the directive is that an environmental claim must be based on scientific evidence and must consider all significant aspects and impacts in assessing the performance of the product. This includes a threshold for being significantly better environmentally than current practice. This, in my opinion, further creates an opportunity for Irish food and drink exports, provided we continue to invest in robust research and validation, coupled with independent validation and certification at scale of our products. As we consider the consumer's ability to make better choices, we know that the say versus do of sustainability remains a wide gap, limited by the challenges of basic needs, affordability, convenience and apathy. However, research from Bórd's Sustainable Nutrition Barometer, updated in late 2024, shows that we are recording higher growth on the adoption curve for sustainability, with growth in the proportion who are well-intended increasing by 3 percentage points, and equally a growth in 1% recorded for the proactives, suggesting that public awareness and associated action is slowly continuing to respond. In trying to understand where consumer, personal and citizens' needs meet, we see a complex matrix of established and emerging themes which offer opportunities for our industry. From the personal sphere perspective, we can see that quality and transparency remain key and that ethical concerns are high in their importance, while for higher purpose, agenda-setting perspective, we see sustainable innovation, food security, systems transition and carbon resonate the most. Important to both spheres, we see tangible sustainability, which includes packaging and waste reduction, but also, interestingly, the theme of protecting nature closely associated with regenerative agriculture. When we examine this more closely, we can see that protecting nature has a high level of importance across most market studies, as does working with nature and regenerative practices. It is also clear that this consumer interest area is slowly becoming more important, and in markets such as France and Germany, we are seeing a high proportion of consumers claim to purchase on this basis. So whilst there might be some that suggest that there is a cooling off amongst consumers towards sustainability, we can see that the evidence suggests the opposite, especially when it comes to nature management and restoration. In fact, overall, the latest research shows clear evidence the consumers are more aligned with purchasing sustainably focused foods for the wider good, albeit the underlying motivations can vary across markets. For example, in France, and maybe unsurprisingly, this support for wider good is underpinned by support for local farmers and their incomes, whilst in Germany it is strongly aligned to protecting the environment, and in Britain, doing the right thing personally is the strongest motivator. In trying to understand how market forces are impacting buyers and their motivations, we recently looked at two key markets, Britain and Germany, to better understand why buyers source sustainable produce. What was interesting was that compliance was the largest motivator on the German customer agenda, whilst in Britain, compliance was a minor factor versus meeting consumer needs and equally keeping up with competition, both at about 30%. Also of interest was the very low level of abdication of responsibility from a sourcing team perspective, confirming the very high levels of integration of sustainable sourcing into everyday buying activity amongst customers. Also interesting in these findings was that the majority of participants believed it was becoming easier to source sustainable products in the marketplace, which is of course positive for citizens, assuming that these products are robustly supported by verifications. However, notwithstanding the job of work which the two directives that I just spoke about earlier might need to do, it is worth recognising that it is easier for these buyers to source product, and that means that competition is intensifying in this area for Irish products. We therefore need to redouble our efforts and continue to build on the position that we have achieved thus far. And that brings us back to our starting point, where the customer is operating in a complex and dynamic marketplace with multiple push and pull factors to consider, so no one solution will meet all needs. Our requirement from an industry point of view is to stay ahead, leveraging our natural advantages and commitments to delivering further and ensuring we are positioning this with the customer in the marketplace to help them navigate that complexity. I'd now like to invite Sarah O'Neill, who is the Head of Global Strategy with Carbery, to the stage, and we're going to spend the next couple of minutes maybe teasing out some of these issues. Sarah, you're very welcome, and thank you for taking the time to chat with us. Maybe to start off, for the audience, you might introduce yourself and explain a little bit about Carbery Group.
Certainly. Well, great to be here. So I work as our Head of Strategy at Carbery. So what that means is I look after our 3-year business strategy, working with our regional teams. And then we have another initiative called Horizon 10, which is a 10-year lens looking at future opportunities and challenges that'll help us be more kind of resilient into the future. Hopefully most of you know Carbery, but for those that don't, we're based in West Cork. We were founded in the 1960s and we're farmer-owned cooperative. We have 3 business divisions: protein, cheese and taste divisions that we have all over Asia and the Americas as well. And I would say that, not just for the sake of it, that innovation and sustainability have really been at the core of a cooperative and of what we've done since the 1960s as well.
Well, I was going to say that you have a deserved reputation for innovation and finding value, so I think that is widely acknowledged, as many do in the dairy industry. And I suppose from that point of view, where do you see that we need as a sector to maybe invest further in meeting the needs of consumers and customers?
So there's probably a few areas that we're looking to invest in at the moment. The first one is more around sustainable nutrition. So, we have a protein business and a cheese business, but over the last few years, there's been a shift in terms of cost requirements, in terms of nutrition requirements, and in terms of sustainability credentials as well. So in the different markets we're in, we kind of play around those different areas to try and advance that portfolio. So whether it's looking at stressed supply chain and our taste side and looking about how we can use new technologies to bring those to markets, that's really key for us. And, our innovation team is very much reliant on not just internal innovation, but working within an ecosystem with startups, with incubators, with a lot of our partners here today as well, with the academia community in Ireland too, to help drive on some of that innovation. And then just one other point there is just on tools and technology. That's really key for us as well in terms of how we're meeting the needs and the role of technology right from farm all the way to shelf, helping us, redesign packaging to redesigning products. That's really critical. So we're investing quite a lot in technology.
One of the things that I find interesting is that how that consumer proposition maybe has changed over the last number of years and how maybe it continues to do that. How do you tackle communicating that to those different cohorts?
Yeah, I think we tend to look at consumers now as very kind of micro-segmented. It's not just, one consumer type we look at. So, You know, when we're working in Asia, we're very much looking at delivering transparency in our products and the trust and safety that's behind them. When you look at some of our European consumers, they're looking for maybe more locally produced, locally sourced products. And then in North America, where it's shifted a little bit to affordability with the food inflation and the cost pressures there, we're communicating, you know, what we're doing to help achieve those metrics. And part of that was probably in the past we did a lot of broadcast messaging in terms of origin, Ireland and all of that. Whereas now it's a bit more behind the scenes what we're doing to help achieve those credentials.
And maybe a broad question, but in your vision for future growth, where does sustainability fit into that agenda?
So I think for us, you know, when we look at our financial targets, it sits right alongside our emission targets as our internal statement. So when we're looking to develop and to grow, it's really the bedrock of what we're doing. Every time we create a new product, we have systems in place to see, you know, what does this mean in terms of production, in terms of sustainability. The efficiencies that we can drive at a production level, but also at farm level, are helping to drive some of that forward as well.
No, I think from our own point of view, we see very much that the focus for Origin Green going into the future is building that sustainability argument into the commercial proposition, that it is part of our competitive advantage. You have the net zero farm at Shannock, and I'd be just interested to explain to the audience that aren't aware of how you use that to communicate some of the initiatives that you're driving.
Great. So Farm Zero C is a model neutral carbon farm that was established back in 2018. And, you know, somebody earlier on mentioned about, you know, how you test out some of these new technologies and how you scale them. And that's the ideal platform for us to look at some of those technologies and to bring in, through whether it's biomanufacturing funds or through Teagasc and our really good partners at UCD and UCC, how we trial some of those technologies. So when we bring our customers on site, I think we had 50 visitors last year. We had visitors from Finland, we had, you know, ministers, we had New Zealand delegations there as well. And it's open source, so we're sharing our findings at a farm level on what we've discovered, and we're taking in learnings from other countries and other nations that are, you know, have similar approaches. So within our first phase, we had a reduction of 38% on emissions at that, you know, pilot level, and then the next ambition was to scale it to our replicator farms. We're now moving on to phase 2, which is a different focus on areas such as, you know, increased water management, soil, the social science behind it as well. And we're continuing to kind of use that as a platform with our customers to say, this is us in action, really trying to solve some of those challenges that they're facing. Again, we're B2B, so there could be manufacturers or retailers, so they're, you know, the challenges they're facing, how we're trying to address them.
Okay, that brings me to a point that I think is very topical in maybe some of the narrative that's out there, that perhaps there's a doubt that maybe the sustainability agenda at commercial level is somehow waning. From my own point of view, in having the opportunity to meet customers around the world, I don't believe that is the case. I believe that certainly in Europe and in Asia, that is becoming stronger and stronger. And indeed, talking to some of our most important multinational companies who are based in the United States, while some of the headline commitments as we get to 2030 and they're becoming more challenging, maybe they are reframing them in some cases, but I don't really see any diminution of that ambition. I don't know what your experience is. Maybe you might elaborate on that.
I think there has been a political softening in some regions in terms of the stance and maybe rolling back in some of the legislation. But for us on the ground, like we have facilities in Illinois and in Ohio, and just as a practical example, we put together a voluntary sustainability team called the Green Team. And, you know, I think the response we had in North America to people joining that team was phenomenal. It outstripped any of our other regions. And they're all areas, you know, it could be efficiency at the site. It's looking at the stressed vanilla or coffee or, you know, cocoa supply chains, how we address that. At a consumer level, I think there's a real appetite to still address those challenges. Like when you look at the cost of some of the climate-related impacts over the last 2 years, it's been 450 billion. So for consumers in North America, they're living those impacts with the wildfires, with all of the natural disasters day by day. So I think at a consumer level, I don't think the softening has been as dire as as made out to be.
A lot of talk, obviously, about our future competitiveness. I'd be interested to maybe get your take on where does that fit in with the sustainability agenda.
I think Origin Green gave us a great platform, a decade ago to start talking to our consumers and engaging with our consumers about, why we're different, how we have this phenomenal grass-based system here. And I think now with our adoption of technology, with the appetite for change here from our farmers at our farm level across the country, that will continue to be critically important to what we do and how we do it. So, from our perspective, it continues to be at the core of our future resilience and our future existence, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I think our USP will always be based in grass-based production, but demonstrating how it's done more sustainably is going to have a commercial impact and help our competitiveness. Thank you for sharing the platform with me, and happy to hand this work back to Helen, who's the pro. So thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you very much to Jim and Sarah. Jim, I could go home early and you could take over for the rest of the day, no problem. OK, I think you've all earned your coffee, so we're going to give you 30 minutes for a coffee break. So we'll say back here at 11:05. At 11:05 back for coffee. It's served out in the foyer, and to remind you again, those poster presentations are there. If you haven't yet had a chance, try and take a look at them. Thank you.